Welcome to The Road to Zero, a future-proof podcast, as we explore the changing nature of our economy as we look for prosperity and opportunity in not only preserving, but also improving our environment. Today on The Road to Zero, we are talking to Professor David Layzell, the Director of CEASAR and also an energy systems architect at the Transition Accelerator. Welcome, David.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Yes, a pleasure to have you. So tell us, how did you go from a professor of biology to being someone really heavily involved in hydrogen and future energy systems?
Well, I guess as a biologist, I got into biology a long time ago. There was an oil crisis coming on almost 45, 50 years ago that really drove home to me that energy was oil and gas were really important constituents within our food production systems. And that oil shock of the 1970s, there were real concerns at the time that shortage of energy was going to have a real negative impact on food production. And there was real concerns about us having mass starvation in the 1980s, if you go back and look at the literature at the time. So that convinced me that from an energy basis, I was really interested in understanding energy flow through plants and through agricultural systems. I got into looking at material and energy flows through plants like soybeans and lupins and other plants, understanding biological nitrogen fixation in detail. That got me into hydrogen because a byproduct of biological nitrogen fixation is hydrogen gas. So I became really interested in gases. And then I became a professor at Queen's University, and for 20 years I studied plant gas exchange, energy and material flows through plants. And by the late 1990s, it became very clear when we started really looking at climate change issues that biological systems had been managing basically atmospheric greenhouse gases for about 500 million years, multiple billions of years. And in fact, that Canada had a lot of biology, and there was an opportunity for our biological systems to help us in managing greenhouse gases. So in the late 90s, I set up a BioCap Canada Foundation, which was all looking at biological solutions to climate change, and ran that for 10 years. We invested $60 million in across Canada at different universities. And I was still a professor at Queen's, but doing this on the side. And this, in the end result of that was really learned a lot about climate change. I got hired to come to Calgary in 2008 to look at setting up carbon management within our on our fossil fuel system within a Western Canadian perspective on that. And that really got me interested in the bigger energy systems of Canada, the material and energy flows through all of the Canadian systems, from electricity production and oil and gas production. And I started taking the tools and technologies I'd learned in studying plants and started applying them to the energy systems of Canada. And it really became clear to me about 4 or 5 years ago, that if we're going to get to net zero, we've really got to change the energy carriers we use. We cannot have carbon-based energy carriers in our energy system, like gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, natural gas. They have to be replaced with zero-emission energy carriers. And that really got me interested in hydrogen. And from an analysis of that, found out that actually Canada is one of the cheapest places in the world to make hydrogen without carbon emissions. And that realization about 2 to 3 years ago really drove most of the work we've been doing for the last 2 to 3 years, that there was suddenly then an opportunity that in the pathway to net zero, hydrogen was going to play a critical role, maybe not quite as important as electricity, but certainly up there. And so figuring out how to make that happen has been my passion, I guess, for the last few years.
Yeah. And then let's hear a bit more about that, because you also started the Transition Accelerator out of that passion. So tell us a bit.
Well, I partnered with a number of the philanthropic organizations in Canada that had been funding my work we're very interested in trying to take this approach and looking at it, the approach that I've been using, and try to look at it in a more pan-Canadian sense. So I partnered with some colleagues from Carleton University, James Meadowcroft, and from Normand Mousseau from University of Montreal. And the three of us worked with the philanthropic organizations to set up the Transition Accelerator in 2019. And we've got some funding for it and managed to launch it, hired Dan Wicklum as our CEO. And that was in the summer of 2019. And one of the projects that the Transition Accelerator is looking at, it's a not-for-profit charitable with a pan-Canadian perspective to identify what are the good things and bad things about human systems today, our energy systems, but also the broader systems, and try to look at how we can develop credible, compelling transition pathways to switch them to systems that are better for society, often lower cost, more convenient, more comfortable, but also are net zero. So we're looking at how do we harness the disruptive forces that are already present within our various systems, human systems today, but direct those disruptions to achieve climate change goals. So that's kind of the focus that we've had within the Transition Accelerator. It's a stepping back and putting the climate change issue within a bigger systems change perspective, and then identifying transition pathways that will take us from where we are today to a better future.
Yeah. And what are some of the more promising pathways you've developed or discovered in that research?
Well, one of the things, certainly in the hydrogen is one that we see as being, I personally been working on within the Transition Accelerator as very promising, partly because many countries of the world in the last 3 years, including Canada, have committed to net zero by 2050, and they've committed to significant emission reductions by 2030. And that was actually a pretty big shift. All in the previous 25 years, I've been working on climate change issues and trying to identify transition pathways. It's always been about incremental change. Oh, we need a 5, 10, 15% change by some date in the future. And everything was about, let's not do anything disruptive. Let's not make sure we have no, we're not really talking about reaching a specific target in the future. We're just sort of nudging things down a little bit. And I'm afraid that that's resulted in a lot of investment in dead-end pathways, there's millions of ways we can have small incremental reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. But when you actually talk about getting to net zero in, say, 20, 30 years from now, there's not a very many options to do that. That's net zero means, oh my gosh, we cannot continue to be using the energy carriers we're using today, right? We got to change our energy carriers, which means we need to change the technologies that we use to provide energy services. It's not just a matter of switching to a different low carbon fuel in our gasoline engines, because the reality is that's not going to get us to net zero, right? That's only going to be incremental. So that required us to step back and say, what do these new energy systems look like? And then hydrogen was clearly needed to be part of it. And then say, well, what's Canada's opportunity to be in a hydrogen economy? And what we found out is that, in fact, actually Canada is probably poised as one of the big potential winners in a transition to a net zero economy, because we can make hydrogen either from electricity sources, from green hydrogen as it's called, or from fossil fuel sources and biomass sources where you capture the CO2 and sequester it in the subsurface. We could actually make it less expensive than just about anybody else. We can move it around in large quantities and be a major world supplier, but also a major user of that hydrogen. And we can actually do it certainly in the terms of transportation fuels, at a cost which is competitive or even lower costs than some of our existing systems. It's certainly lower costs when you put in the cost of the climate change cost of our carbon intense fuels today.
Yeah, that's a good point, because what we're seeing in the market is carbon is going to cost more and more, so it's going to add a cost that we don't see now, right? The internalization of that cost is going to happen. And I hear even before that, there's also quite the cost competitiveness already before you factor that in.
Well, exactly. In Western Canada, for example, British Columbia, Northern BC, in the whole, essentially the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin, Alberta, Southern Saskatchewan, we can make hydrogen without carbon emissions on an energy basis at about half the wholesale cost of diesel. And that's including the cost of capturing and sequestering the CO2. Now, we have to do it at scale. We can't do it if we're just, doing it on a laboratory bench. You're not going to do it. You're not going to do it in a small facility. We have to be talking about hydrogen being made at something, approaching the scale of a refinery, et cetera. And so we can make it at about half the wholesale cost, about 1/3 the retail cost of diesel fuel today. That's without all of the carbon taxes in. Now you start putting carbon taxes on there, and it even gets more attractive. Okay. The problem is we have other things we need as well. Hydrogen is more difficult to move around than gasoline or diesel. It's a gas. You have to compress it. You have to constrain it. You can't just pour it into a tank and drive it down the road. It's not quite that way, at least yet. And so we have to, there is more expensive. And we see hydrogen as being targeting not in all the same markets that we use gasoline or diesel for today, but particularly the large heavy-duty markets where battery technology just has no way that it's likely within the next 30 years going to be able to serve those markets, right? My sense, if you have a car, a personally owned car, I would argue the best thing to do is get an electric car and plug it in. If you're in at night, we use our cars 4% of the time. In the last COVID year, maybe 2% of the time, and 96 to 98% of the time it's parked. Plug it in and recharge it, and it'll work just fine. That's the best technology. But when you're talking about big trucks or trains or ships that use a lot of diesel, right? They need to be working in being used 20 hours a day, 18 hours a day, 20 hours a day. They don't have time to plug them in. And even if they did plug them in and charge them, the amount of energy they need to do their duty, you couldn't carry enough batteries on board, right? On a big truck, right? Yeah, and you don't have the range. So we need a chemical-based fuel. And hydrogen is where that really works. That's the market that we see as opportunity.
And what do you see is going to take? What are the big changes or initiatives going to take to start us down that road?
I think one of the first things we need to recognize that we need to change the entire value chain when you're coming to hydrogen. We've tried in the past. The world's tried in the past to shift to hydrogen. About 20 years ago was the last big push in the early 2000s. And it wasn't quite ready at that time. There's an understanding that one needs to not only produce low-cost hydrogen, we need to produce the demand for that. Because we've had a vicious cycle before where there was no hydrogen supply because there was no demand, and there was no demand because there was no supply. So what we have to do is figure out how we have supply and demand and grow them together, which means we have to connect the supply and demand. We need ways of moving the hydrogen around. What we've been arguing, and indeed we're very pleased, we've had a lot of input into the government over the last few years, and discussions with different groups on this, is the need to build around hydrogen hubs or hydrogen nodes, places in Canada where we can make low-cost electrolytic hydrogen or carbon-based hydrogen with sequestration, that we can do that and produce that at significant quantities at low cost, and then find nearby build demand centers, and then connect the two in the most cost-effective way as possible, in a way that where public money is going to be needed initially. But once the public money's in, it doesn't need ongoing public money. You've actually got the infrastructure and the value chain there that when the public money stops going in, it's self-sustaining. And in fact, actually competitive with our existing diesel markets, we would say, is the big opportunity.
Okay. Yeah.
So we're working around hydrogen nodes across Canada.
Have it available and people start coming and start using it.
Exactly.
Okay. And what do you see as the export potential of hydrogen? So we're talking here about using it inside our own economy, but what's the export potential?
It's actually very large. We produced a report in the fall where we suggested that our analysis was that, first of all, that we already make a lot of hydrogen in Canada, about 8,000 tons a day of hydrogen. It's all used for industrial use. It's not used as a fuel. We figure the domestic market in Canada could be up to 60,000 tons a day, 8 times more, right? So up to 64,000, something like that. And we think that the market potential for export is another 60,000 tons a day. So, so we're talking quite large. We can make it inexpensively. How we export it, some pipeline to United States is a possibility. A pipeline to the West Coast or East Coast. Export to Germany has announced they would like to import large amounts of low carbon hydrogen. Japan and South Korea have both come out. They're saying millions of tons of hydrogen they want to import of low carbon hydrogen by 2030 and 2040. And so whether, what's the form of that hydrogen? Where do we make it? How much of it is green? How much of it is blue hydrogen, if you like the different colors? And what form does it move in? Does it move as liquid hydrogen? Does it move as ammonia? That's a possibility. A lot of interest in that. Does it move as a liquid organic hydrogen carrier? So that's all about the economics and the logistics and the interest of the markets.
Okay. And a quick question of just to get an idea of the value of this market, especially on the export side, would you say it would be just as big as the current fossil fuel export market?
Our estimate is about potential market size for this in Canada is about $100 billion a year, potential market for hydrogen. That's domestic and export, about $50 billion for export. And I think that's it could be larger. We've talked to some government agencies we've been working with, and they think we're underestimating the market potential. Yeah. We have to. There's going to be competition. The Australians are already, Saudi Arabia and Australia are already making low carbon hydrogen and sending it to Japan. We're not there yet. We need to get moving. But I think the market is on the same scale as our current fossil fuel market. And it actually could create more jobs here because instead of selling a primary energy source that has to be upgraded and refined, and somebody else makes that economic benefit of taking crude oil to diesel fuel or whatever, we're talking about selling end use fuel, hydrogen as the energy carrier and end use fuel, and that has per unit of energy, it's worth more.
Yeah. So what I here's an opportunity to keep this vibrant economy that has been developed in Western Canada just as big and potentially bigger by transitioning to this fuel.
And I think it's a transition is what we're talking about in a way. And I hope that we can get the ducks aligned so that it's really attractive, and certainly for both users of the fuel, the trucking companies, the train companies, and others, as well as the suppliers of the fuel, to say, look, this is where we want to invest our money and create jobs. So that's what we hope. We're doing as much as we can to get us there.
Okay, and then as with the Transition Accelerator, what is it that you're looking for? Any partnerships, or what would help you in your journey and what you're up to?
We're really focusing our efforts around a number of trying to develop a hub or nodal strategy that can be what are the how do you bring together as a nonprofit? We're not looking at becoming, taking an equity share. We're trying to bring partners together, industry from different sectors, governments, the academics, and to say, what does a value chain look like in each region? The one in Vancouver is going to be very different than one in Calgary or Edmonton, very different from Sarnia or Montreal, Quebec City. And so each one of them has to be hand-built. And what we're trying to do is develop the tools, the insights, the analytical tools, the methodologies to build these new value chains across Canada. And so what we are looking for is partners. We're looking for funding support that helps us to hire the people locally that will actually do this, and to guide them to create these nodes, and then connect the nodes together with hydrogen corridors, where essentially we can actually create an environment where the end users, the trucking companies and train companies, will say, look, we want to move as faster than ever to move to hydrogen, because not only is it cost effective, there's real value for the environment, and it actually helps their brand for what they're offering. So we're trying to put all those pieces together across Canada.
Okay, so anybody in those regions that want to get on board to contact your organization, and
we'd love it, especially if they had some funding to help us to actually build this out, because obviously we need to get the people trained up and start building these things in different regions.
Oh, that's amazing. And it's great that your organization is around to really help those communities and those businesses to actually make the transition. So exactly. Great support.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for being our guest today.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
To hear more about our podcasts, showcase events, or the Futureproof Network, please visit us at www.futureproof-network.com.